The Beggar, a short story by Anton Chekhov. Kind sir, be so good as to notice a poor, hungry man. I have not tasted food for 3 days. I have not a 5-kopeck piece for a night's lodging. I swear by God. For 5 years I was a village schoolmaster and lost my post through the intrigues of the Zemstvo. I was the victim of false witness. I have been out of a place for a year now. Skvortsov, a Petersburg lawyer, looked at the speaker's tattered dark blue overcoat, at his muddy, drunken eyes, at the red patches on his cheeks, and it seemed to him that he had seen the man before. "And now I am offered a post in the Kaluga province," the beggar continued, "but I have not the means for the journey there. Graciously help me. I am ashamed to ask, but I am compelled by circumstances." Skvortsov looked at his galoshes, of which one was shallow like a shoe, while the other came high up the leg like a boot, and suddenly remembered. "Listen, the day before yesterday I met you in Sadovoy Street," he said, "and then you told me, not that you were a village schoolmaster, but that you were a student who had been expelled. Do you remember?" No, that cannot be so," the beggar muttered in confusion. "I am a village schoolmaster, and if you wish it, I can show you documents to prove it." "That's enough lies. You called yourself a student, and even told me what you were expelled for. Do you remember?" Skvortsov flushed, and with a look of disgust on his face, turned away from the ragged figure. "It's contemptible, sir," he cried angrily. "It's a swindle. I'll hand you over to the police, damn you. You are poor and hungry, but that does not give you the right to lie so shamelessly." The ragged figure took hold of the door handle and, like a bird in a snare, looked round the hall desperately. I am not lying," he muttered. "I can show documents." "Who can believe you?" Skvortsov went on, still indignant. "To exploit the sympathy of the public for village schoolmasters and students. It's so low, so mean, so dirty. It's revolting." Skvortsov flew into a rage and gave the beggar a merciless scolding. The ragged fellow's insolent lying aroused his disgust and aversion, was an offence against what he, Skvortsov, loved and prized in himself: kindliness, a feeling heart, sympathy for the unhappy. By his lying, by his treacherous assault upon compassion, the individual had, as it were, defiled the charity which he liked to give to the poor with no misgivings in his heart. The beggar at first defended himself, protested with oaths, then he sank into silence and hung his head, overcome with shame. "Sir," he said, laying his hand on his heart, "I really was lying. I am not a student and not a village schoolmaster. All that's mere invention. I used to be in the Russian choir, and I was turned out of it for drunkenness. But what can I do? Believe me, in God's name, I can't get on without lying. When I tell the truth, no one will give me anything. With the truth, one may die of hunger and freeze without a night's lodging. What you say is true. I understand that. But what am I to do?" "What are you to do? You ask, what are you to do?" cried Skvortsov, going close up to him. "Work. That's what you must do. You must work." "Work? I know that myself, but where can I get work?" "Nonsense. You are young, strong, and healthy, and could always find work if you wanted to. But you know you are lazy, pampered, drunken. You reek of vodka like a pothouse. You have become false and corrupt to the marrow of your bones, and fit for nothing but begging and lying. If you do graciously condescend to take work, you must have a job in an office, in the Russian choir, or as a billiard marker, where you will have a salary and have nothing to do. But how would you like to undertake manual labour? I'll be bound you wouldn't be a house porter or a factory hand. You are too genteel for that." "What things you say, really," said the beggar, and he gave a bitter smile. "How can I get manual work? It's rather late for me to be a shopman, for in trade one has to begin from a boy. No one would take me as a house porter because I am not of that class, and I could not get work in a factory. One must know a trade, and I know nothing." "Nonsense. You always find some justification. Wouldn't you like to chop wood?" "I would not refuse to, but the regular wood choppers are out of work now." Oh, all idlers argue like that. As soon as you're offered anything, you refuse it. Would you care to chop wood for me? Certainly I will. Very good. We shall see. Excellent. We'll see. Skvortsov, in nervous haste, and not without malignant pleasure, rubbing his hands, summoned his cook from the kitchen. Here, Olga, he said to her, take this gentleman to the shed, and let him chop some wood. The beggar shrugged his shoulders as though puzzled, and irresolutely followed the cook. It was evident from his demeanour that he had consented to go and chop wood, not because he was hungry and wanted to earn money, but simply from shame and amour propre, because he had been taken at his word. It was clear, too, that he was suffering from the effects of vodka, that he was unwell, and felt not the faintest inclination to work. Skvortsov hurried into the dining room. There, from the window which looked out into the yard, he could see the woodshed and everything that happened in the yard. Standing at the window, Skvortsov saw the cook and the beggar come by the back way into the yard and go through the muddy snow to the woodshed. Olga scrutinized her companion angrily and, jerking her elbow, unlocked the woodshed and angrily banged the door open. Most likely we interrupted the woman drinking her coffee, thought Skvortsov. What a cross creature she is. Then he saw the pseudo-schoolmaster and pseudo-student seat himself on a block of wood and, leaning his red cheeks upon his fists, sink into thought. The cook flung an axe at his feet, spat angrily on the ground, and, judging by the expression of her lips, began abusing him. The beggar drew a log of wood towards him irresolutely, set it up between his feet, and diffidently drew the axe across it. The log toppled and fell over. The beggar drew it towards him, breathed on his frozen hands, and again drew the axe along it as cautiously as though he were afraid of its hitting his golosh or chopping off his fingers. The log fell over again. Skvortsov's wrath had passed off by now. He felt sore and ashamed at the thought that he had forced a pampered, drunken, and perhaps sick man to do hard, rough work in the cold. Never mind. Let him go on, he thought, going from the dining room into his study. I am doing it for his good. An hour later, Olga appeared and announced that the wood had been chopped up. Here, give him 1/2 ruble, said Skvortsov. If he likes, let him come and chop wood on the 1st of every month. There will always be work for him. On the 1st of the month, the beggar turned up, and again earned 1/2 ruble, though he could hardly stand. From that time forward, he took to turning up frequently, and work was always found for him. Sometimes he would sweep the snow into heaps, or clear up the shed. At another, he used to beat the rugs and the mattresses. He always received 30 to 40 kopecks for his work, and on one occasion, an old pair of trousers was sent out to him. When he moved, Skvortsov engaged him to assist in packing and moving the furniture. On this occasion, the beggar was sober, gloomy and silent. He scarcely touched the furniture, walked with hanging head behind the furniture vans, and did not even try to appear busy. He merely shivered with the cold and was overcome with confusion when the men with the vans laughed at his idleness, feebleness, and ragged coat that had once been a gentleman's. After the removal, Skvortsov sent for him. Well, I see my words have had an effect upon you, he said, giving him a ruble. This is for your work. I see that you are sober and not disinclined to work. What is your name? Lushkov. I can offer you better work, not so rough, Lushkov. Can you write? Yes, sir. Then go with this note tomorrow to my colleague, and he will give you some copying to do. Work, don't drink, and don't forget what I said to you. Goodbye. Skvortsov, pleased that he had put a man in the path of rectitude, patted Lushkov genially on the shoulder and even shook hands with him at parting. Lushkov took the letter, departed, and from that time forward did not come to the backyard for work. 2 years passed. One day, as Skvortsov was standing at the ticket office of a theatre, paying for his ticket, he saw beside him a little man with a lambskin collar and a shabby cat-skin cap. The man timidly asked the clerk for a gallery ticket and paid for it with kopecks. Lushkov, is it you? Asked Skvortsov, recognizing in the little man his former woodchopper. "Well, what are you doing? Are you getting on all right?" "Pretty well. I'm in a notary's office now. I earn 35 rubles. "Well, thank God, that's capital. I rejoice for you. I am very, very glad, Lushkov. You know, in a way, you are my godson. It was I who shoved you into the right way. Do you remember what a scolding I gave you, eh? You almost sank through the floor that time. Well, thank you, my dear fellow, for remembering my words." "Thank you too," said Lushkov. "If I had not come to you that day, maybe I should be calling myself a schoolmaster or a student still. Yes, in your house I was saved and climbed out of the pit. I'm very, very glad. Thank you for your kind words and deeds. What you said that day was excellent. I am grateful to you and to your cook. God bless that kind, noble-hearted woman. What you said that day was excellent. I am indebted to you as long as I live, of course, but it was your cook, Olga, who really saved me." "How was that?" "Why, it was like this. I used to come to you to chop wood, and she would begin, 'Ah, you drunkard, you God-forsaken man, and yet death does not take you.' And then she would sit opposite me, lamenting, looking into my face and wailing, 'You unlucky fellow. You have no gladness in this world, and in the next you will burn in hell, poor drunkard. You poor, sorrowful creature.' And she always went on in that style, you know. How often she upset herself, and how many tears she shed over me I can't tell you. But what affected me most, she chopped the wood for me. Do you know, sir, I never chopped a single log for you. She did it all. How it was she saved me, how it was I changed, looking at her, and gave up drinking, I can't explain. I only know that what she said, and the noble way she behaved, brought about a change in my soul, and I shall never forget it. It's time to go up, though. They are just going to ring the bell." Lushkov bowed and went off to the gallery. Gooseberries, a short story by Anton Chekhov. This is the second part in his celebrated trilogy on the trials and tribulations concerning love. The whole sky had been overcast with rain clouds from early morning. It was a still day, not hot, but heavy, as it is in grey, dull weather when the clouds have been hanging over the country for a long while, when one expects rain and it does not come. Ivan Ivanich, the veterinary surgeon, and Birkin, the high school teacher, were already tired from walking, and the fields seemed to them endless. Far ahead of them, they could just see the windmills of the village of Mironositskoye. On the right stretched a row of hillocks which disappeared in the distance behind the village, and they both knew that this was the bank of the river, that there were meadows, green willows, homesteads there, and that if one stood on one of the hillocks, one could see from it the same vast plain, telegraph wires, and a train which in the distance looked like a crawling caterpillar, and that in clear weather one could even see the town. Now, in still weather, when all nature seemed mild and dreamy, Ivan Ivanovich and Birkin were filled with love of that countryside, and both thought how great, how beautiful a land it was. "Last time we were in Prokofy's barn," said Birkin, "you were about to tell me a story." "Yes, I meant to tell you about my brother." Ivan Ivanovich heaved a deep sigh and lighted a pipe to begin to tell his story, but just at that moment the rain began. And 5 minutes later, heavy rain came down, covering the sky, and it was hard to tell when it would be over. Ivan Ivanovich and Birkin stopped in hesitation. The dogs, already drenched, stood with their tails between their legs, gazing at them feelingly. "We must take shelter somewhere," said Birkin. "Let us go to Alahin's. It's close by." "Come along." They turned aside and walked through mown fields, sometimes going straight forward, sometimes turning to the right, till they came out on the road. Soon they saw poplars, a garden, then the red roofs of barns. There was a gleam of the river, and the view opened onto a broad expanse of water with a windmill and a white bathhouse. This was Sofino, where Alehin lived. The watermill was at work, drowning the sound of the rain. The dam was shaking. Here, wet horses with drooping heads were standing near their carts, and men were walking about covered with sacks. It was damp, muddy, and desolate. The water looked cold and malignant. Ivan Ivanovich and Birkin were already conscious of a feeling of wetness, messiness, and discomfort all over. Their feet were heavy with mud, and when, crossing the dam, they went up to the barns, they were silent, as though they were angry with one another. In one of the barns there was the sound of a winnowing machine. The door was open, and clouds of dust were coming from it. In the doorway was standing Alehin himself, a man of 40, tall and stout, with long hair, more like a professor or an artist than a landowner. He had on a white shirt that badly needed washing, a rope for a belt, drawers instead of trousers, and his boots, too, were plastered up with mud and straw. His eyes and nose were black with dust. He recognized Ivan Ivanovich and Birkin and was apparently much delighted to see them. "Go into the house, gentlemen," he said, smiling. "I'll come directly, this minute." It was a big two-storied house. Alehin lived in the lower story, with arched ceilings and little windows where the bailiffs had once lived. Here everything was plain, and there was a smell of rye bread, cheap vodka, and harness. He went upstairs into the best rooms only on rare occasions when visitors came. Ivan Ivanovich and Birkin were met in the house by a maid-servant, a young woman so beautiful that they both stood still and looked at one another. "You can't imagine how delighted I am to see you, my friends," said Alehin, going into the hall with them. "It is a surprise. Pelageya," he said, addressing the girl. "Give our visitors something to change into. And by the way, I will change too. Only I must first go and wash, for I almost think I have not washed since spring. Wouldn't you like to come into the bathhouse? And meanwhile, they will get things ready here." Beautiful Pelageya, looking so refined and soft, brought them towels and soap, and Alehin went to the bathhouse with his guests. "It's a long time since I had a wash," he said, undressing. "I've got a nice bathhouse, as you see. My father built it, but I somehow never have time to wash." He sat down on the steps and soaped his long hair and his neck, and the water round him turned brown. "Yes, I must say," said Ivan Ivanovich meaningly, looking at his head. "It's a long time since I washed," said Alehin with embarrassment, giving himself a second soaping, and the water near him turned dark blue, like ink. Ivan Ivanovich went outside, plunged into the water with a loud splash, and swam in the rain, flinging his arms out wide. He stirred the water into waves which set the white lilies bobbing up and down. He swam to the very middle of the mill pond and dived, and came up a minute later in another place, and swam on and kept on diving, trying to touch the bottom. "Oh, my goodness," he repeated continually, enjoying himself thoroughly. "Oh, my goodness." He swam to the mill, talked to the peasants there, then returned and lay on his back in the middle of the pond, turning his face to the rain. Birkin and Alehin were dressed and ready to go, but he still went on swimming and diving. "Oh, my goodness," he said. "Oh, Lord, have mercy on me." "That's enough," Birkin shouted to him. They went back to the house, and only when the lamp was lighted in the big drawing room upstairs, and Birkin and Ivan Ivanovich, attired in silk dressing gowns and warm slippers, were sitting in armchairs, and Alehin, washed and combed in a new coat, was walking about the drawing room, evidently enjoying the feeling of warmth, cleanliness, dry clothes, and light shoes, and when lovely Pelageya, stepping noiselessly on the carpet and smiling softly, handed tea and jam on a tray. Only then Ivan Ivanovich began on his story, and it seemed as though not only Birkin and Alehin were listening, but also the ladies, young and old, and the officers who looked down upon them sternly and calmly from their gold frames. "There are two of us brothers," he began. "I, Ivan Ivanovich, and my brother, Nikolai Ivanovich, 2 years younger. I went in for a learned profession and became a veterinary surgeon, while Nikolai sat in a government office from the time he was 19. Our father, Chimsha Himalaysky, was a cantonist, but he rose to be an officer and left us a little estate and the rank of nobility. After his death, the little estate went in debts and legal expenses. But anyway, we had spent our childhood running wild in the country. Like peasant children, we passed our days and nights in the fields and the woods, looked after horses, stripped the bark off the trees, fished and so on. And you know, whoever has once in his life caught perch or has seen the migrating of the thrushes in autumn, watched how they float in flocks over the village on bright, cool days, he will never be a real townsman and will have a yearning for freedom to the day of his death. My brother was miserable in the government office. Years passed by, and he went on sitting in the same place, went on writing the same papers and thinking of one and the same thing, how to get into the country. And this yearning by degrees passed into a definite desire, into a dream of buying himself a little farm somewhere on the banks of a river or a lake. He was a gentle, good-natured fellow, and I was fond of him, but I never sympathized with this desire to shut himself up for the rest of his life in a little farm of his own. It's the correct thing to say that a man needs no more than 6 feet of earth. But 6 feet is what a corpse needs, not a man. And they say, too, now, that if our intellectual classes are attracted to the land and yearn for a farm, it's a good thing. But these farms are just the same as 6 feet of earth. To retreat from town, from the struggle, from the bustle of life, to retreat and bury oneself in one's farm, it's not life. It's egoism, laziness, it's monasticism of a sort, but monasticism without good works. A man does not need 6 feet of earth or a farm, but the whole globe, all nature, where he can have room to display all the qualities and peculiarities of his free spirit. My brother Nikolai, sitting in his government office, dreamed of how he would eat his own cabbages, which would fill the whole yard with such a savory smell, take his meals on the green grass, sleep in the sun, sit for whole hours on the seat by the gate, gazing at the fields and the forest. Gardening books and the agricultural hints in calendars were his delight, his favorite spiritual sustenance. He enjoyed reading newspapers too, but the only things he read in them were the advertisements of so many acres of arable land and a grass meadow with farmhouses and buildings, a river, a garden, a mill, and mill ponds for sale. And his imagination pictured the garden paths, flowers and fruit, starling coats, the carp in the pond, and all that sort of thing, you know. These imaginary pictures were of different kinds according to the advertisements which he came across, but for some reason in every one of them he had always to have gooseberries. He could not imagine a homestead. He could not picture an idyllic nook without gooseberries. Country life has its conveniences, he would sometimes say. You sit on the veranda and you drink tea, while your ducks swim on the pond. There is a delicious smell everywhere, and the gooseberries are growing. He used to draw a map of his property, and in every map there were the same things: A. House for the family, B. Servants' quarters, C. Kitchen garden, D. Gooseberry bushes. He lived parsimoniously, was frugal in food and drink. His clothes were beyond description. He looked like a beggar, but kept on saving and putting money in the bank. He grew fearfully avaricious. I did not like to look at him, and I used to give him something and send him presents for Christmas and Easter, but he used to save that too. Once a man is absorbed by an idea, there is no doing anything with him. Years passed. He was transferred to another province. He was over 40, and he was still reading the advertisements in the papers and saving up. Then I heard he was married. Still with the same object of buying a farm and having gooseberries, he married an elderly and ugly widow without a trace of feeling for her, simply because she had filthy lucre. He went on living frugally after marrying her and kept her short of food, while he put her money in the bank in his name. Her first husband had been a postmaster, and with him she was accustomed to pies and homemade wines, while with her second husband she did not get enough black bread. She began to pine away with this sort of life, and 3 years later she gave up her soul to God. And I need hardly say that my brother never for one moment imagined that he was responsible for her death. Money, like vodka, makes a man queer. In our town, there was a merchant who, before he died, ordered a plateful of honey and ate up all his money and lottery tickets with the honey, so that no one might get the benefit of it. While I was inspecting cattle at a railway station, a cattle dealer fell under an engine and had his leg cut off. We carried him into the waiting room. The blood was flowing. It was a horrible thing, and he kept asking them to look for his leg and was very much worried about it. There were 20 rubles in the boot on the leg that had been cut off, and he was afraid they would be lost. "That's a story from a different opera," said Birkin. "After his wife's death," Ivan Ivanovich went on, after thinking for half a minute, "my brother began looking out for an estate for himself. Of course, you may look about for 5 years and yet end by making a mistake and buying something quite different from what you have dreamed of. My brother Nikolai bought through an agent a mortgaged estate of 330 acres with a house for the family, with servants' quarters, with a park, but with no orchard, no gooseberry bushes, and no duck pond. There was a river, but the water in it was the colour of coffee, because on one side of the estate there was a brickyard, and on the other a factory for burning bones. But Nikolai Ivanovich did not grieve much. He ordered 20 gooseberry bushes, planted them, and began living as a country gentleman. Last year I went to pay him a visit. I thought I would go and see what it was like. In his letters, my brother called his estate Chumbaroklov Waste, alias Himalaysko. I reached alias Himalaysko in the afternoon. It was hot. Everywhere there were ditches, fences, hedges, fir trees planted in rows, and there was no knowing how to get to the yard, where to put one's horse. I went up to the house and was met by a fat red dog that looked like a pig. It wanted to bark, but it was too lazy. The cook, a fat, barefooted woman, came out of the kitchen, and she, too, looked like a pig, and said that her master was resting after dinner. I went in to see my brother. He was sitting up in bed with a quilt over his legs. He had grown older, fatter, wrinkled. His cheeks, his nose, and his mouth all stuck out. He looked as though he might begin grunting into the quilt at any moment. We embraced each other and shed tears of joy and of sadness at the thought that we had once been young and now were both grey-headed and near the grave. He dressed and led me out to show me the estate. "Well, how are you getting on here?" I asked. "Oh, all right. Thank God. I am getting on very well." He was no more a poor, timid clerk, but a real landowner, a gentleman. He was already accustomed to it, had grown used to it, and liked it. He ate a great deal, went to the bath-house, was growing stout, was already at law with the village commune and both factories, and was very much offended when the peasants did not call him Your Honour. And he concerned himself with the salvation of his soul in a substantial, gentlemanly manner, and performed deeds of charity, not simply, but with an air of consequence. And what deeds of charity! He treated the peasants for every sort of disease with soda and castor oil, and on his name day had a Thanksgiving service in the middle of the village, and then treated the peasants to a gallon of vodka. He thought that was the thing to do. Oh, those horrible gallons of vodka. One day the fat landowner hauls the peasants up before the district captain for trespass, and next day, in honor of a holiday, treats them to a gallon of vodka, and they drink and shout hurrah. And when they are drunk, bow down to his feet. A change of life for the better, and being well fed and idle, develop in a Russian the most insolent self-conceit. Nikolai Ivanovich, who at one time in the government office was afraid to have any views of his own, now could say nothing that was not gospel truth, and uttered such truths in the tone of a prime minister. Education is essential, but for the peasants it is premature. Corporal punishment is harmful as a rule, but in some cases it is necessary, and there is nothing to take its place. "I know the peasants and understand how to treat them," he would say. "The peasants like me. I need only to hold up my little finger, and the peasants will do anything I like. And all this, observe, was uttered with a wise, benevolent smile. He repeated 20 times over, "We noblemen, I as a noble." Obviously, he did not remember that our grandfather was a peasant and our father a soldier. Even our surname, Chimsha Himalesky, in reality so incongruous, seemed to him now melodious, distinguished, and very agreeable. But the point just now is not he, but myself. I want to tell you about the change that took place in me during the brief hours I spent at his country place. In the evening, when we were drinking tea, the cook put on the table a plateful of gooseberries. They were not bought, but his own gooseberries, gathered for the first time since the bushes were planted. Nikolai Ivanovich laughed and looked for a minute in silence at the gooseberries, with tears in his eyes. He could not speak for excitement. Then he put one gooseberry in his mouth, looked at me with the triumph of a child who has at last received his favourite toy, and said, "How delicious!" And he ate them greedily, continually repeating, "Ah, how delicious! Do taste them." They were sour and unripe, but as Pushkin says, "Dearer to us the falsehood that exalts, than hosts of baser truths." I saw a happy man whose cherished dream was so obviously fulfilled, who had attained his object in life, who had gained what he wanted, who was satisfied with his fate and himself. There is always, for some reason, an element of sadness mingled with my thoughts of human happiness, and, on this occasion, at the sight of a happy man, I was overcome by an oppressive feeling that was close upon despair. It was particularly oppressive at night. A bed was made up for me in the room next to my brother's bedroom, and I could hear that he was awake, and that he kept getting up and going to the plate of gooseberries and taking one. I reflected how many satisfied, happy people there really are. What a suffocating force it is. You look at life, the insolence and idleness of the strong, the ignorance and brutishness of the weak, incredible poverty all about us, overcrowding, degeneration, drunkenness, hypocrisy, lying. Yet all is calm and stillness in the houses and in the streets. Of the 50,000 living in a town, there is not one who would cry out, who would give vent to his indignation aloud. We see the people going to market for provisions, eating by day, sleeping by night, talking their silly nonsense, getting married, growing old, serenely escorting their dead to the cemetery. But we do not see, and we do not hear those who suffer, and what is terrible in life goes on somewhere behind the scenes. Everything is quiet and peaceful, and nothing protests but mute statistics. So many people gone out of their minds, so many gallons of vodka drunk, so many children dead from malnutrition. And this order of things is evidently necessary. Evidently, the happy man only feels at ease because the unhappy bear their burdens in silence, and without that silence, happiness would be impossible. It's a case of general hypnotism. There ought to be behind the door of every happy, contented man someone standing with a hammer, continually reminding him with a tap that there are unhappy people, that however happy he may be, life will show him her laws sooner or later. Trouble will come for him, disease, poverty, losses, and no one will see or hear, just as now he neither sees nor hears others. But there is no man with a hammer. The happy man lives at his ease, and trivial daily cares faintly agitate him like the wind in the aspen tree, and all goes well. That night I realized that I too was happy and contented, Ivan Ivanovich went on, getting up. I too at dinner and at the hunt liked to lay down the law on life and religion, and the way to manage the peasantry. I too used to say that science was light, that culture was essential, but for the simple people reading and writing was enough for the time. Freedom is a blessing, I used to say. We can no more do without it than without air, but we must wait a little. Yes, I used to talk like that, and now I ask, for what reason are we to wait? Asked Ivan Ivanovich, looking angrily at Birkin. Why wait, I ask you? What grounds have we for waiting? I shall be told it can't be done all at once. Every idea takes shape in life gradually, in its due time. But who is it says that? Where is the proof that it's right? You will fall back upon the natural order of things, the uniformity of phenomena. But is there order and uniformity in the fact that I, a living, thinking man, stand over a chasm and wait for it to close of itself, or to fill up with mud at the very time when perhaps I might leap over it, or build a bridge across it? And again, wait for the sake of what? Wait till there's no strength to live. And meanwhile, one must live, and one wants to live. I went away from my brother's early in the morning, and ever since then it has been unbearable for me to be in town. I am oppressed by its peace and quiet. I'm afraid to look at the windows, for there is no spectacle more painful to me now than the sight of a happy family sitting round the table drinking tea. I am old and am not fit for the struggle. I am not even capable of hatred. I can only grieve inwardly, feel irritated and vexed. But at night my head is hot from the rush of ideas, and I cannot sleep. Ah, if I were young! Ivan Ivanovich walked backwards and forwards in excitement and repeated, "If I were young!" He suddenly went up to Alehin and began pressing first one of his hands and then the other. "Pavel Konstantinovich," he said in an imploring voice, "don't be calm and contented. Don't let yourself be put to sleep. While you are young, strong, confident, be not weary in well-doing. There is no happiness, and there ought not to be. But if there is a meaning and an object in life, that meaning and object is not our happiness, but something greater and more rational. Do good." And all this Ivan Ivanovich said with a pitiful, imploring smile, as though he were asking him a personal favour. Then all three sat in armchairs at different ends of the drawing-room and were silent. Ivan Ivanovich's story had not satisfied either Birkin or Alehin. When the generals and ladies gazed down from their gilt frames, looking in the dusk as though they were alive, it was dreary to listen to the story of the poor clerk who ate gooseberries. They felt inclined, for some reason, to talk about elegant people, about women. And their sitting in the drawing-room where everything, the chandeliers in their covers, the armchairs and the carpet under their feet, reminded them that those very people who were now looking down from their frames had once moved about, sat, drunk tea in this room, and the fact that lovely Pelagia was moving noiselessly about was better than any story. Alehin was fearfully sleepy. He had got up early, before 3 o'clock in the morning, to look after his work, and now his eyes were closing. But he was afraid his visitors might tell some interesting story after he had gone, and he lingered on. He did not go into the question whether what Ivan Ivanovich had just said was right and true. His visitors did not talk of groats, nor of hay, nor of tar, but of something that had no direct bearing on his life, and he was glad and wanted them to go on. "It's bedtime, though," said Birkin, getting up. "Allow me to wish you good night." Alehin said good night and went downstairs to his own domain, while the visitors remained upstairs. They were both taken for the night to a big room where there stood 2 old wooden beds decorated with carvings, and in the corner was an ivory crucifix. The big, cool beds, which had been made by the lovely Pelagia, smelt agreeably of clean linen. Ivan Ivanovich undressed in silence and got into bed. "Lord, forgive us sinners," he said, and put his head under the quilt. His pipe, lying on the table, smelt strongly of stale tobacco, and Birkin could not sleep for a long while, and kept wondering where the oppressive smell came from. The rain was pattering on the window panes all night,